Wedding photographers, what's the weirdest wedding you've attended to? Story 1, I photographed a wedding this year where the couple got married in a boxing ring complete with let-in fights. They were the main event. Ring girls, entrances, a ring announcer, corner teams, etc. It was wicked fun. The bride had written basically a comedy routine for the two of them for the ceremony, and they had ring commentators adding lines too. The only bride I've photographed that's been so comfortable dropping the C-bomb. Definitely won't forget that anytime soon. We have a pics blog on our site at Record Makers. Photography, but I'm on my phone ATM. Story 2. Not a photographer, but I was at a wedding where instead of a unity candle to symbolize two becoming one, they made a unity peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So everyone sat there while two people quickly tried to eat a PB&J, which is basically impossible. 20 minutes later, they rode off on a tandem bike, which I actually liked. Story 3. Couple weekends ago. Wedding party was 24 deep and not particularly cooperative. They were fun, just didn't listen. Anyway, about 10 minutes into the ceremony, the pastor started mopping his brow with his sleeve, like taking eyeglasses off and hardcore wiping his face. After another 10 or so minutes, he walked over and got a chair. You might see where this is headed. Moments after sitting down, he, his pants, got up and left. The best man picked up his binder and finished the ceremony. The pastor came back at the very end to make it official. Holy, literally. Story 4. I'm not a photographer, but I went to a Peter Pan wedding once where the bride was in a nightgown like Wendy. The bridesmaids were all dressed up like Tinker Bell, the groom was Peter Pan, the groomsmen were all Lost Boys, and the ushers were dressed as pirates. I had no idea beforehand and thought I was hallucinating when I first walked in. Story 5. Sort of related. My girlfriend's sister went to a wedding where a professionally hired photographer somehow either lost all the pictures or didn't have a memory card in. They had to regather the wedding party and take more, while asking for any personal pictures that guests had taken. Now that I think about it, kind of reminds me of that Friends episode where Ross and Chandler have to recreate wedding pictures. Story 6. I wouldn't label myself a wedding photographer, but I am a photographer, and one of my college roommates asked me to photograph her wedding. I had shot a couple small ceremonies before then, so I explained what she could reasonably expect from me and quoted her a very reasonable price. The wedding was about 3 hours away from where I lived, so my boyfriend, who is now my husband, and I woke up at the crack of dawn ready for a long day. I took photos of her and her bridesmaids getting ready, and my boyfriend did the same with the guys. The ceremony was nice, nothing fancy, and afterwards I kept them, the families, the bridal party for portraits. I asked the bride and groom to kiss for one of the first photos, and they just stared at me. They had been middle school sweethearts, and I had seen them kiss before, but for some reason they were super awkward about it. I got whatever shots I could get and moved on to the reception, which was in the church gym. The reception just got more awkward. There was no DJ. I don't even remember music, but maybe I'm wrong. And no one in charge, so I was told to direct everything. All right, everyone, we're going to cut the cake now. Asterisk, a little later asterisk. Okay, single ladies, we're going to toss the bouquet. Gather over here. At one point, the bride came up to me and asked me to ask her groom to do a garter toss because he had all of a sudden decided he didn't want to do it, and she didn't want to bother him about it. So I went to the groom and told him his wife was requesting a garter toss and gave him specific step-by-step instructions on what he was going to do to fulfill that request. After all of that, my boyfriend and I were waiting around to get photos of the getaway car and the send-off. Those are usually fun photos that couples want. The bride comes over to me and tells me that they're wrapping up and I can go. I told her I'd wait until the send-off when she informs me there was going to be no send-off. They were just going to pack up their gifts and go to the groom's parents' house for dinner. So we pack up our gear and head out. Most of the guests were gone anyway, and everything from the reception was being cleaned up. We stop at a local grocery store to get some snacks and caffeine for the road, and who do we bump into? The bride's father, wandering around the grocery store. By far the weirdest wedding I've ever attended. Story 7. Front page and 7 comments. Choo-choo. There was one wedding that always sticks out in my mind. Incredibly hilarious, but also cringeworthy and kind of sad. The two people that were getting married weren't really in love. He was a social freak, and she was just desperate to get pregnant. Both in their early 40s. I think he was having second thoughts all the way up to the day itself. I don't think she was having second thoughts, but I still don't think it's what she really wanted to do. It made matters more hilarious. Strange that the main reason for this guy getting married was to seem normal, but inheriting the bride's dead grandmother's cottage also seemed to be a pretty good incentive for him. So it comes to the big day, and surprise, surprise, he doesn't want to get married. He turns up on the bride's doorstep, claiming she's had an affair with the best man. It's pretty much a load of, but it turns out they did kiss when drunk. Perhaps enough to cause some trouble on the doorstep, but hardly enough to cancel the entire wedding. So it comes to the ceremony now, and surprise, surprise again, he's nowhere to be found. The best man has also performed a disappearing act. Fast forward an hour or two, and all the guests have now arrived and been seated. The bride shows up, and she's pretty pissed, although I bet she saw it coming. The father of the bride looks like a tomato, he's that angry. Not the kind of guy you want to off either. A real British country farmer type with a shotgun to boot. After a few dirty glances from the bride, I just stopped taking photos. It had long passed recording memories of their happy day and had turned into capturing evidence of the forthcoming murder. To make matters worse, water started leaking from the rafters in this church. Very strange, considering it was a gorgeous day outside. It ruined a woman's dress below, and the bride father went to investigate and fix the leak. He goes up the stairs to the rafters to sort it out. Suddenly, a tapestry is pulled back, and we all just hear, "Surprise!" Who was it? It was the groom and the best man. Everybody was just confused, shocked, and bewildered. We didn't know whether to laugh or not. Was it a joke, or was he literally hiding from his wedding? Turns out that the groom and best man got to the church early. But after having second thoughts, he thought it would be a good idea to hide in the rafters until everybody had left. Oh, and the water that was leaking from the rafters? It turns out that it was. That's right. The best man had decided to hide with the groom, but needed to take rather than going to the toilet like a normal person, he decided to take in a bucket he found up there. So yep, the fell through the holes in the bucket, down through the rafters, and onto the poor lady's dress below. We never really found out if it truly was a big joke, or if he was really hiding, but the look on the bride's face suggested that she was not happy. Not happy one little bit. The groom didn't look great either. He had the face of a naughty kid that had just been caught doing something wrong whilst simultaneously shitting his pants. Come the ceremony, things got even worse. Asterisk. As they started saying "I do," she burst into tears. She's literally reading her vows now, and she's crying. And they're not tears of happiness. I can't believe they both actually went through with it. They were divorced several weeks later, though she did get the baby she wanted. TLDR. Groom hides. Best man pisses on a woman and bride experiences pre-regret but proceeds anyway. Footage of wedding. https://www YouTube watch v DexEQMLSB8MU. Story 8. Instead of a legitimate wedding meal, they seriously just had an all-you-can-eat macaroni table. Just macaroni. At the same wedding, bride didn't like the groom's boutonniere and had him replace it at the reception with the fake flowers from the cake. It was one of the first weddings I worked. We'll try and dig for the photos. Different wedding. Bride's mom saw me go into the ladies' room, followed me in, and started to yell at me from outside the stall for using the utilities while being paid, while I pissed, audibly. Was hired to do the photos for a joint Greek wedding and Orthodox baptism. Baptism before the wedding, then left the baby on a little changing bed in the font of the room and performed the wedding, while the soaking wet baby cried loudly. Not sure if that's tradition, but everyone looked uncomfortable. At the reception, very, very old men were tipping the bride for giving them lap dances. It was an adventure. There's more. I just can't recall them right now. I've been doing wedding photo video for approximately 3 years now. Edit. How do words work? Story 9. I remember a similar thread a while ago on here about a bride who warned the groom not to mash the cake in her face or something. The groom proceeded to do just that. She immediately called off the wedding. Would try to find a link. Story 10. I'm not a photographer, but I am a wedding DJ. My favorite wedding ever had roughly 600 guests. This is all fine and dandy until you realize they were planning for 400. This wedding was located in Bumno, where Missouri, I drove 6 hours to get there, and was located in a barn. When I walked in, I saw a 10-tier wedding cake. Completely cake. No cardboard, no, just cake. Anyways, I plug in and get set up, and realize the generator they had out back didn't have enough power to consistently run my system. I can plug it in at my house and run it. The bride shows up for her reception and has been drinking all day. They do their grand entrance and rush to their first dance before dinner because they are weird like that. Then the bride goes and throws up. Food is served halfway through, they run out, so one of the groomsmen ran for a bunch of subs from a Subway. In the middle of nowhere, then they move on to cake. As they are cutting it, the cake collapses under its own weight and falls on the bride. We called 911. TLDR drove out to middle of nowhere. Bride puked, cake fell down, ambulance was called. Early night. Story 11. At a very fancy outdoor reception in a beautiful botanical garden, several groomsmen pooled all their intelligence and decided grab the groom and throw him into a giant fountain. I got pictures of it all. Then I got bitched out for not preventing it from happening. The B&G were humiliated and furious. Whatever, my job was to document the day, not police the actions of others. Story 12. Obligatory, not a photographer, but I worked at a tuxedo shop for nearly 10 years and did plenty of weddings, so many to choose from. An obviously gay groom, a 5 months pregnant bride that tried to the bitter end to hide it, a party girl marrying a recovering alcoholic that chose his wedding day to relapse, a couple where she was pleased as punch and he did not seem to want to wed. The weird ones stand out, but the dreary, sad, depressing weddings are the ones where the couple doesn't even seem to like each other. Happened a lot. Well, Been together 5 years and live together, might as well get married. Or the couple that, booking their tuxedos, mind you, she mentions when the kids come, and he was like, what? Like they weren't on the same page about kids. It's usually the couples that view marriage as a next step that seem utterly depressed on their wedding day. One that stands out, though as a good weird, is when we got a call that the couple canceled their wedding and wanted a refund. Well, it was in the time frame, so we said we'd refund while trying to act sympathetic to them calling off their wedding. They didn't cancel the marriage, though. They called on their way to Vegas to elope because wedding planning was too stressful. So that was a nice surprise. Story 13. I'm not a professional photographer, just a friend of the groom, but I took some of the photos of this wedding. http://www.geckosetsc.com/htm/wedding_photos. HTM. It was definitely not your typical wedding, but a good time was had by all the reptile geeks. Yes, that alligator was alive at the time. Story 14. I'll keep mine short. The ceremony and the people were all pretty normal. Just one thing. The groom who hired me was a kingpin in the local Mexican mafia. He was my dealer's, at the time, connection and heard about me. He had strict instructions that all of the film would be turned over to him and all I had to do was shoot. I tried to politely refuse. But he offered me $800 cash and a solid pound of whichever strain, from his garden shed no less, from these giant landscaper-sized bags of weed. I smoked quite a bit back then, so I took him up on the offer. The food and cake was lovely. Story 15. I shot a wedding for an extended relative a few weeks ago. My family on that side are pretty rough, particularly in the manners department. They just have no sense of time and place and are pretty loud in many ways. My cousin was getting married, and her sister was in the wedding party. The sister has a daughter named Aubrey, so one of my uncles, who was sitting in the front row, sat her on his lap during the ceremony while she stood up front. Just while the brides were reading out their vows, a simply inhuman sound comes from the front row. Asterisk p asterisk. Unmistakably a wet juicy. I've heard my relatives make some pretty interesting sounds before, but this was a new low. Everyone looked at my uncle, where the sound came from. While the brides are staring at him, looking nervous, he yells out, "Hey, you guys hear that? Aubrey shit her pants!" Story 16. Last year I did a Halloween wedding. It was pretty weird but kind of fun. Asterisk. The sand ceremony containers were labeled wool of bat and spider cider and poured into a skull asterisk. Her flowers had a skull in them, styrofoam I think. Asterisk. The cake was Nightmare Before Christmas themed asterisk. Everyone dressed up for the reception. Second weirdest wedding I shot was completely in French. I think they were either South African or Haitian. They had 15 old ladies, all dressed in the same blue dress with huge blue hats, sing a few parts of the ceremony, very out of tune. The preacher's cadence, again all in French so I had no idea what was going on, reminded me of a fire and brimstone gospel preacher. Oh, and the ceremony was 5 hours long, and they ran so far behind that there was barely enough time to do the formals. Third was an Indian-Pakistani wedding. 350 guests. They set up a stage and lit it like a sitcom set. Not sure if it's a cultural thing or just this group, but they loved getting their picture taken. They loved taking selfies too. I think they had everyone they've ever met at their wedding. A few of the group portraits were in the 65 people range. One of my favorite parts of wedding photography is getting to see all the different cultural aspects of weddings. Story 17. The wedding was quite normal. It was the after party that got weird. Right as the after party started, one of the wedding MCs took the mic and said, "I want everyone to have a good time, but please don't take your shirts off till at least midnight." I found this weird, but thought it was a strangely worded joke. But nope, I was wrong. Midnight hit and everyone was ripping their shirts off. Groomsmen, bridesmaids, old people, fat people, everyone. I should mention this took place in a small town in Saskatchewan, Canada. Story 18. As a part-time second job, I worked at a catering company on a team that did private events. I did a few weddings. One was creepy as. We were told by this elderly woman that we were to tell none of our friends about the wedding and that this was a private event. Everyone, about 30 people, ate steak burnt to a crisp, a baked potato loaded with butter, and some green beans. We're prepping food, and while I'm waiting for the potatoes and green beans to get done, I peek into the wedding and see a man, probably early to mid-40s, kind of looks like G-Man from Half-Life, and a very underage-looking girl. I text my boss who said he would look into it, but I doubt he did. Story 19. I shot a wedding at Burning Man. The bride and groom seemed to grow up in an atmosphere of jumping from one guru and cult to another. Their wedding was a 12-hour event going from just before sunset to sunrise. The all-night reception had roughly 12 hours of music, with guests flying in to sing one song, and one of them having to fly right back out because he had a concert the next night at the Gorge at George Washington. There were gurus, speakers, people handing out food, people burning incense and sage to purify the guests. The wedding party had elaborate costumes, headdresses, and body painting. It was a little weird even for Burning Man, mainly for the language. It was all in English, but the combinations of words would start to really raise eyebrows for the uninitiated like myself. Words such as gender fluidity. One speaker started listing gender terms from abstract to so obvious a 3-year-old would start to get annoyed. The straight and the round, the phallic and the yonic, the yin and the yang, the and the vagina. I also might add that the bride and groom met at Burning Man, had their first date there, got engaged there. They were so well connected that they could buy tickets for a bunch of videographers and photographers and fly in guests for a few hours, including the groom's 90-year-old grandparents. They were also the most in love couple I've ever seen, giving speeches and vows straight from the heart about how in love they were for several minutes at a time. Story 20. I photographed a wedding last year that started off pretty normal. Low-key, very nice interracial couple. Everything seemed fine and normal. I realized soon, though, that the two families were vastly different and highly incompatible. The groom's family was very conservative and proper, well-dressed and quiet-mannered. Maybe I'll even go as far to say a little snobbish. The bride's family was quite the opposite. They were there to be loud and have a good time. This is all typical, but what happened next got weird. As I started taking photos, I noticed that there was not a maid of honor, but instead 2 best men. I quickly realized that the bride's best man was actually the bride's identical twin, only the short-haired lesbian version, dressed in a tux. She was also clearly intoxicated, to the point where she would cooperate with taking group photos. Things were still going relatively okay until later in the evening, after dinner and cake and some dancing. The best man bride's sister picks up the microphone and announces she has a special surprise for the new couple. She motions to the DJ, the lights dim, and music begins. In walks Anaconda, the night's drag queen Tina Turner impersonator. Apparently, it was thought that a drag show would be the perfect way to bring the families together. After about 5, if the most awkward moments ever, members of the groom's family started walking out. His face was beet red, and he eventually excused himself from the room and didn't return. I took this as my cue to check out as well. As much as I truly wanted to stay for the Beyoncé portion of the show, I didn't want to be around to witness the awkward tension between the two families. Delivered the photos a couple weeks later, and never heard anything about what happened with the couple. Story 21. I photographed a wedding several years ago for a Pakistani Muslim couple. Bride's brother hated me and my assistant. My wife and I are both white Christian. We were welcomed by the rest of the family into the mosque, and we found the overall atmosphere very comfortable. Brother wanted nothing to do with me, hated having his picture taken. Fast forward a few years, and he's making local news as a known jihadist in Charlotte, NC. He was hosting jihadi websites from his parents' basement before moving to the Arabian Peninsula. He eventually took a drone missile to the face while associating with Anwar al-Awlaki. He is responsible for publishing and contributing the Inspire Terror magazine that helped direct Boston Marathon bombers to build the pressure cooker bombs. Anyway, I offered up my wedding photos to the FBI, who were very interested in them. I had a very long interview with a nice agent in a local Panera. TLDR, I shot a terrorist once at a wedding. Terrorist's name was Samir Khan, http://www, mcclatchedic.com/news/nationworld/national/national security/article 247811111, HTML. Story 22. One that didn't happen. A few weeks before the date, we get a call from the MOB, mother of the bride, saying that the groom is getting cold feet. Mob says to show up anyway, and we'll see what happens. The day of, I show up to the venue. Bride is there, groom is not. They're on the phone with him trying to figure out whether he's coming. He does show up, and everyone disappears somewhere to have a talk with the rabbi. After about an hour, I'm told the wedding is off. Here's the weird part. They were supposed to get married the previous year, and he canceled that wedding too. Why the bride agreed to a second one is a total mystery. Story 23. I was recently the best man at a Wiccan wedding. They called in blessing from the spirits of each of the 4 directions, smudged everyone in with sage, and used a sword to establish some sort of an energy circle, IDK. When people needed to enter or re-enter the wedding area, the chick that set up the spirit circle thing would walk over and use the sword to open a doorway for the people to enter or exit. I was sitting there judging the ceremony in my head when I had a very honest thought of, this is no more or less ridiculous than any other religious ceremony that I have attended. As weird as it was actually probably the nicest wedding that I've ever been to. Story 24. I bartended several weddings. One time the photographer fell asleep, just sitting at a table sleeping. Another more memorable time was with a bride and groom and wedding party that really liked to drink. House rules said the bride and groom can have all they want to drink. Plus they were staying in the hotel that was on property, so I wasn't concerned about drinking and driving. I got those 2 riggedy wrecked. As everyone was leaving, they did a couple shots and went upstairs to their room. I was tearing down the bar and cleaning up when security came up to let me know they kicked them out for being too loud. They literally went upstairs and got kicked out before I ended my shift. Story 25. Not a photographer, but a member of the string quartet. I played for a wedding that was in the middle of a redwood grove near a cliff over the Pacific Ocean, one of the nicest locations I've ever played at. The groom was half Christian, half Native American, I don't know what tribe, and the bride was half Jewish, half Buddhist. The wedding combined all four cultures and religions. I was only there for the actual ceremony, but there was a dream catcher above the minister's head. There was a lot of poetry and some sort of candle ceremony that I struggle to remember. A lot of the poetry was written by the groom himself, who had a beard nearly down to his belly button, and the bride asked that the recessional music be a string quartet rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody. It was a fairly small wedding, but I am so happy I got to be a part of it because if the ceremony was that fun, I can only imagine what the reception was like. Story 26. Worked in a photography studio for a while, and the guy who owned it had a few stories about weird weddings. The most memorable was when he was at a gypsy wedding. Things were a bit odd from the start. Over 400 people were meant to be there, but only around a tenth of that actually turned up. Where were they? All locked up because there'd been a big fight the night before between rival groups. The bride turned up in one of the really scruffy scrap metal pickup trucks that they drive here in the UK, complete with scrap still in the back. The bride also couldn't read right, so when it came to signing the registry, she couldn't, and someone else had to do it for her. The reception afterwards was by far the worst part, though. The owner thankfully wasn't there for this, but there was a different photographer there who was videoing it all, and he happened to be staying on to video the reception. By this time, most of the people locked up had been released, so they all arrived into the reception in yet more pickup trucks. One of the rival gypsy groups heard about the wedding and decided to crash the reception. It all ended up in a huge fight where there was a lot of glassing involved. The guy videoing was threatened and had his very expensive camera smashed, so that there was no evidence of who was involved in the fight. Gypsies are such nice people. Story 27. A couple I shot wanted to go do their formals on their own graves. They already had their grave plots purchased and their own tombstones. We did an entire formal session standing on their graves. Story 28. Not quite a photographer, but I used to work weddings, as did my colleague. I fortunately/unfortunately didn't get to attend this wedding. I'll preface it with the fact that the bride's side of the family had done extremely weird. The father had been arrested a couple months ago for diddling kids. He was a pastor at a church, apparently well respected too. Also, one of the bride's sisters had been imprisoned some time ago for sacrificing her own child by cutting the poor kid's heart out. So, yeah, fucked up family. At some point during the ceremony, we usually have one or two members of staff in the room just in case anything goes wrong. But my colleague, the only staff member inside the room, was asked to leave during the ceremony. Shortly afterwards, she heard what she can only describe as voodoo witchcraft chants and lots of screaming. Thankfully, nothing had been damaged during the voodoo, but she's still curious to this day about what went on in there. Story 29. Not photography, but videography. I was shooting wedding videos for a company back in 2012, and the weirdest wedding was at a place called the Fun Dome. All the groomsmen wore baggy white tuxedos with matching green paisley pumas and vests. The bride had a red mohawk with paisley shaved in the side and wore a dress where 80% of her were hanging out. All the bridesmaids tried to stuff themselves into dresses at least 2 sizes too small, so there were rolls sticking out everywhere. When I showed up to the Fun Dome, a cheap hotel in South Dallas that was neither fun nor had a dome, I asked the lady at the front desk where the wedding was supposed to take place. She said right around the corner. When I looked around, all I saw was a small atrium with an indoor pool that everyone's room looked out on. The smell of chlorine was thick in the air, and kids from the pool were screaming at the top of their lungs. They set up for the wedding right beside the pool and playground. During the ceremony, they did that sand ceremony, where all the children from both sides of the family poured different colored sand into a vase. They had so many kids from different marriages come up one by one that after the 11th kid, it started to feel like that I Am Spartacus scene. For the entrance to the reception, the groom came in first, dressed like a pimp, wearing a fuzzy green paisley coat, white wide-brim hat, cane, and lots of gold. Then, Crazy in Love started playing, and the bride entered, first and twerked her way all across the room until she started Dry the Groom. After that, the reception was basically nothing but people hardcore grinding on each other. The most awkward part was during dinner. Everyone was sitting down eating, except for the only white girl there, a 6-year-old girl on all fours on the dance floor, thrusting her butt in the air for several songs. Story 30. The bride and groom brought out a ping pong table and played beer pong for 20 minutes right in the middle of their wedding. No one else was allowed to play, just them two, red cups and all. Story 31. I was second shooter at this Catholic wedding once. Myself and the primary shooter are walking around during the ceremony, trying to get in a good position for the "you may now kiss the bride" thing, because usually couples get if you miss that asterisk shot. Only these guys skip it. They kneel in front of the priest for like 3 hours. Well, felt like 3 hours, what with the tirades against gay marriage. He now pronounces them whatever, and they leave. Me and the primary shooter look at each other from opposite ends of the church, both wondering if we blacked out from lack of common sense or something. After the procession left, I went up to the priest to ask if we missed something, and he yelled at me for walking around during the thing, because apparently we don't do that at this church, and apparently I need to learn my place. I've seen weirder things at weddings, but not while I was the photographer. Story 32. Not really weird, but challenging to shoot for reasons non-photographers might not understand fully. One wedding I shot was a couple of Irish descent who had a lot of black friends. Getting shots with both groups in them exposed properly was not the easiest task, especially because the reception all had really shitty lighting and had mirrors everywhere that I had to look out for as well. It came out fine in the end, partly thanks to my Canon 1D Mk2, which was state-of-the-art at the time. Story 33. Wedding video photo company I work for shot a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory themed wedding, complete with an Oompa Loompa and Willy Wonka as the celebrant. Story 34. Not a wedding photographer, but my workplace has a lot of weddings. The wedding that stands out most in my head is a Nightmare Before Christmas themed wedding. The colors of the table and chairs were black and dark purple, which you don't really see much of in weddings. The cake topper was a skeleton version of the bride and groom. The groom was wearing a cloak and top hat, while the bride was wearing a long black dress and corset. But the weirdest part about the wedding is that they had a fucking goat walk down the aisle with one of the groomsmen. Definitely one of my weirdest days at work. Story 35. I work for an event florist. It was a very hot summer day, and the bride rode in on a horse. Well, the moment she stepped off to walk down the aisle, the horse dropped dead. The wedding had to be halted as a tractor was brought in to drag the corpse away. It was awkward. Story 36. I once photographed a wedding where the groom spent the entire night dancing with and talking to the bride's sister. He only danced with the bride twice. To be fair to him, the bride turned out to be my one and only bridezilla. She was awful. Story 37. Friend of mine attended a wedding that was Winnie the Pooh themed and dry, no alcohol served. I imagine these are the kinds of people who put red Rudolph noses on their SUVs at Christmas time. Story 38. I once had an Armenian priest scream at me in the middle of a ceremony in front of 400 guests for placing my foot on the stage to get a better angle. He yelled, "Remove your foot immediately. This is not a shopping mall." Story 39. Banquet event server. At picturesque log cabin restaurant overlooking a river, we have a large outdoor seating area for the main restaurant activities, and then an auxiliary bar and additional areas that people rent out for parties. Occasionally people will do their ceremonies there. Usually it's an older couple that has already done the go-all-out wedding thing and are now remarrying and want to have a small but still nice ceremony with close friends and family. So this one summer we had what I would call blue-collar crowd. Great people, just a little rough. And of course, Oregon, being the gracious host that she is, decided to have rain and thunderstorms the day of the ceremony. I get there 8 hours before and help my manager install tarps along the entire length of the pergola that covered the upper area where the ceremony would be. Looked like, but at least the guests would be dry. Guests arrive and they start drinking. A lot. DJ shows up and starts drinking. A lot. 2 hours into the service and everyone is hammered, but for the most part everyone is staying cool. We cut a couple people off, but they had a shuttle coming to get them and bring them back to the hotel, so it was fine. Ceremony time. It has been raining slightly the whole time, and call it fate, bad luck, or whatever. Right before saying "I do," the tarp rips and what water was collected up top came down on Grandma's table. So that was fun. To cap this wedding off right, the DJ blacked out, called the bride A and puked on his equipment, and then proceeded to get in a fight with groomsmen, and a whole mess of other guys that were there. Definitely one to remember. TL Doctor rained on the wedding, tarp ceiling broke and soaked Granny. DJ calls bride A, then gets in a fight with everyone there. I made $200 in tips though, so it's all good. Story 40. I worked as a second shooter for a wedding photographer in college for about a year. Toward the end of that year, one of the girls that I worked with was getting married, and we were of course shooting the wedding. I was on stage shooting video, and I was facing out toward the crowd. The bride and groom had their backs to the audience while the priest was giving his wedding sermon. Whenever we shot video, we'd put a lapel mic on the groom so we could hear the vows, and the on-stage video person, me, wore an earpiece so we could keep track of audio levels. As the priest wandered the stage and droned on through a typical Catholic wedding, we all got a bit bored. All of a sudden, the bride, who knew how all the tech worked, shot me a glance, then started whispering to her husband about all the filthy things she was going to do to him that night. Since their backs were to the crowd, no one could see what they were doing, and I had to try and keep a straight face the whole time. I almost bit through my lip trying not to laugh. Story 41. I take back my first post after giving it some thought. The weirdest wedding I shot was in a Burger King. I'm on my phone, or I would link the pictures. And yes, the king married them. Story 42. I'm not a photographer, but, This story needs to be told. Free my mom's most recent wedding, I was tooling around with the photographer's camera and had a, oh, what's this button do? Turns out it wipes the memory card. It said delete, and I wanted to delete a picture I had taken of myself. Luckily, though, they had saved to the internal memory.